Welcome, D20 players. I have updated my quick reference sheet. I have added the 2024 Player's Handbook stuff to it, and I marked in blue what's new or changed on the quick reference sheet. You can grab this sheet on d20play.com. So let's look at your turn, pretty much unchanged. I have updated all the references here as well, and you'll note that a lot of stuff moved into either Chapter 1 or into the glossary, which is pages 360 through 377, or some things moved into both. Watch out for the stuff that is in both, because sometimes it doesn't give the full rule in the body of the rules, but it does give the full rule in the glossary. I haven't found any that are the reverse of that. Okay, so now let's look at your movement. What's new in movement? You can move through an ally now, and it's not difficult terrain. And you can move through hostile creatures that are incapacitated or tiny. You used to always be able to move through creatures that are two sizes different than you. Add to that incapacitated and tiny. For climbing and for swimming, they added a default athletics check for those two, DC 15. Difficult terrain. Difficult terrain does not include tiny hostile creatures. If they're smaller or bigger in hostile, difficult terrain. If they're tiny, not difficult terrain. They don't include the inverse there, but I would include the inverse. That tiny, you can move through any creature space, not being difficult terrain. Dropping prone. I don't recall if this was in 2014. Unable to drop prone if your speed is 0. You might have already been there. Flying. If you are incapacitated, that's new. You will drop to the ground, fall to the ground, unless you can hover or you have magic keeping you aloft. I don't know if that was intentional and a misunderstanding, because incapacitated does not stop your movement, but evidently it's going to stop your flying movement per that rule. Grappling moves. You can grapple creatures. You can move them when you're grappling them. You move at half your speed, unless you're 2 or more sizes bigger than them, or unless they're tiny. Then you can move at your full speed. Although I wouldn't let a tiny creature move another tiny creature at full speed, although the rules don't get into that level of detail. Jumping unchanged except for one thing. The high jump is now the standing high jump is half of the running high jump. It used to have a different equation. That's all movement changes. Now we'll look at the actions, and under attacks in the glossary, they tell you about you can equip or unequip a weapon with each attack. Casting spell is gone. That's replaced with magic. We'll get to that in a second. The help action, they spelled out that you can help with a skill or a tool if you're proficient with the skill or the tool. Hiding. So if you have 3/4 or better cover, or you're heavily obscured or heavily obscured, and no line of sight, which is odd. I think you'd need to have full cover to have not line of sight. So I'm not sure how you'd have 3/4 cover and then not have line of sight to you. But as it is, that's the rule. And you roll, if you get a 15 or higher, you're invisible. You need to retain what you rolled, though, because it'll be used if anyone tries to look for you. So if you rolled a 20, you need to remember you rolled a 20, because that's what they will need to find you. There's still passive perception, so they might not need to even take an action to find you if you roll low, like a 15 or something. Now this is interesting, because what comes out of being invisible, or the hide condition, ends when you talk louder than a whisper, make a sound louder than a whisper, or you attack, or you use a spell with a verbal component. Nothing about if you come into line of sight. And so you'd have to use your judgment as a DM. Line of sight doesn't necessarily mean they can always see you. There's always some obscurement and lighting things that thieves can hide in, right? But if it's a featureless, blank, open room, then that doesn't quite make sense, and you just play that by ear. Influence skill. This is, I think, mostly new. So when you're trying to influence someone, you'll use your deception, your intimidation, your performance, your persuasion, your animal handling. And the person you're trying to influence, or the creature you're influencing, will either be willing, in which case you don't even have to make a check. They'll be hesitant, which is when you make a check, or they'll be unwilling, and that would mean no check will work. So saying they're hesitant, you go on to make a check. The DC to influence them is a DC 15, or their intelligence, whichever is higher. You have advantage if they're friendly toward you, and disadvantage if they're hostile toward you. The magic action, casting spells, using magic items, using magical features. The search skill is insight, medicine, perception, survival, like looking for tracks. The study skill, arcana, history, investigation, nature, religion, and then use a non-magic object. Those are the actions. One action that's a little interesting, that I talked about how they're different between the glossary and the tables, would be the dodge action. So when you're dodging, you grant disadvantage, but you have to see the attacker to do that granting of disadvantage. And that's in the glossary, but not in the chapter 1. So watch out for that. I think maybe the only one I saw that was that grievous. Okay, your attacks, mostly unchanged. There is some clarification on opportunity attacks. Used to be force move, did not give them. They clarify that to be any movement that doesn't use your movement, your action, your bonus action, or your reaction, which is force movement is part of that. Damaging versus multiple targets and rolling for damage. So now you're only going to roll one time for damage if the thing you're doing the damage requires a save for multiple targets against that damage, or like a fireball. But a magic missile, you would roll all the damage separate because there's no save. Unarmed strike has all been brought together into one thing. So you can do damage with an unarmed strike. It's going to be 1 plus your strength mod. You can, as long as the target's no more than one size bigger than you, do a grapple, a shove of 5 feet, or knock prone. And for all of those, the target it's a saving throw, either dex or strength, whichever they're better at. DC being 8 plus your strength mod plus your proficiency bonus. Cover's all the same. We haven't seen the DMG yet, so we don't know if the cover details will stay the same. We'll see when that comes out, and I'll update this accordingly. Okay, then damage, dying, and resting. Chapter 1, Appendix C. The order is codified. Modifiers come first, then resistances, then vulnerabilities. Instant death, it's spelled out that if your hit point max is reduced to 0, instant death. I think that appeared in like lots of the monster descriptions, but not necessarily the player's handbook. Knocking out. If you would bring a creature down to 0, you can instead, with a melee attack, you can instead bring them to 1 hit point, knock them unconscious, and they will start a short rest. And then speaking of rests, the long rest was updated in that it used to give you back half the hit dice you had spent. Now it gives you back all the hit dice you had spent. Spell casting. Casting an armor, you must be trained. You used to say proficient, just a name change there. Concentration, they maxed out the concentration check for taking damage at DC 30, which is if you look at the skills, a nearly impossible skill. So that makes sense. And my players will like that because I up the damage of my monsters a lot. And I've had players have to make more than a DC 30 concentration check. The bonus action spell thing is gone. Replaced with, you can cast one spell with a spell slot per turn. Much more straightforward. One thing that disallows, though, is if you're casting a spell with a slot, you could not counter in the same turn with a slot. Okay, then we come down to miscellaneous rules. A rule that's gone completely is contested checks. Passive perception is still a thing, and they talk about passive checks in general, but the only one they talk about in detail is a passive perception. Falling, they added falling into liquid. 15 athletics or acrobatics check halves your damage there. Heroic inspiration replaces inspiration. It lets you re-roll 1 die. You have to keep the new roll. You can't like share a pool of inspiration where you can just give it to someone when they need it. But what you can do is if you have inspiration and heroic inspiration and you get more, you can give that new one to someone who doesn't have it yet. Surprised. So when you roll for initiative and some of the creatures are surprised, they have disadvantage on initiative. No longer do they have all the special ways they have to interact in the first round. Really simplifies it a lot. I like that change. Conditions. Bloodied is new, and that's when you're at half hit points or less. There is a few class features that call it out. I bet there'll be some monsters that call it out. It's actually not identified as a condition in the glossary, but kind of is one. So I listed it here. Exhaustion, big changes there. So it's still 6 levels of exhaustion, but now instead of doing something different at every level, you get -2 for every level of exhaustion to every attack, check, and save you make, and a -5 to your speed for every level of exhaustion. You still reduce that one with a long rest. That's not actually changed. Should have made that blue. So much simpler to remember. Still very deadly, very bad. You could be minus, 4, 6, 8 on your attacks pretty quick and barely moving. Grappled condition. This is new. You have disadvantage if you're grappled to attack anyone except the grappler. Incapacitated, they clarified that bonus is an action. Bonus actions are actions. Concentration is in there. Speaking is in there. And you have disadvantage on initiative. Then invisible condition. You have advantage on initiative. And you have advantage on attacking creatures. You get disadvantage to them attacking you unless they can see you. That was added in there. We come down to stunned. You are incapacitated. It used to say no move. That's gone. So now, because incapacitated doesn't stop you from moving, you can move around. You can stumble around, which makes sense. That's fine. I don't know if that was intentional, but and I bet you if you're playing a game and you try and do that in a turn, I bet you a lot of people will think you can't do that. Then unconscious. They added unaware of surroundings. Note here that when you're unconscious, you're incapacitated and your speed's 0. So incapacitated definitely is different than having a speed of 0. Okay, mounted combat. Talked about appropriate anatomy in the rules there. They kind of put together everything about if your mount's force moved or you or your mount are knocked prone. They're all a 10 dex save, or you're also going to fall next to your mount. That kind of doesn't make sense. If your mount's knocked prone, do you stay on it if you make that dex save, or do you jump off of it standing? It used to be you'd take a reaction and you'd be standing next to your mount in the old rules, but I don't know what they're going to do there. Underwater combat. Here, there's some tweaks. It's simplified a little bit. So melee weapons, there used to be a list of weapons that give you no disadvantage. Now there's just every piercing weapon gives you no disadvantage. On range weapons, there used to be a list of weapons you could fire short range without disadvantage. That's all gone. Everything has disadvantage on short range. That's the underwater combat changes. And that's it. The rest of these little tweaks I did was for Adventurers League. So here you go. If you want to join a D20 play game, I'm running them all the time. Check out the link here, D28 Play How To, and you can go to d20play.com to grab this copy of the quick reference sheet. I'll have a copy in there with everything marked in blue, and I'll have a copy in there where all the blue is gone and all the crossed outs are gone. So that'll be a quick reference sheet will be that one, and the quick reference sheet changes will be the one with the blue in it. Thanks for watching. I will catch you guys next time.